On the morning of March the 25th, 1978, Halcyon, Ontario woke up the same way it always did. The sun crept over the low rooftops, frost still clung to the grass in shaded yards, and the quiet hum of a small town beginning its day settled into place. Nothing about that Saturday felt unusual. Nothing hinted that by nightfall, Halcyon would be changed forever. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from right now. Amelia Dawson was 12 years old enough to feel grown but still young enough to believe the world was mostly kind. She stood in front of the hallway mirror, brushing her hair with quick, impatient strokes while her younger brother, Lucas Hart, bounced on the edge of the couch nearby, tying and retying his sneakers even though they were already tight. Lucas was 10, all restless energy and curiosity, the kind of kid who asked too many questions and never quite stayed still. Amelia teased him for it constantly, but she was also fiercely protective, the way older siblings often are without realizing it. Their mother, Eleanor Dawson, watched them from the kitchen doorway, coffee cooling in her mug as she mentally ran through the errands she needed to finish that day. She reminded them, gently but firmly, to stick together, to come straight home after their trip to Silver Creek Mall and not to talk to strangers. It was the kind of warning parents gave automatically in the late 1970s, more habit than fear. Halcyon was safe. Everyone knew everyone. Kids walked to school alone. Doors were left unlocked. Danger was something that happened elsewhere, in big cities, on the evening news. Daniel Hart, Lucas's father, stepped in from the porch just as the kids were pulling on their jackets. He ruffled Lucas's hair, smiled at Amelia, and reminded them to be back by dinner. Lucas groaned dramatically. Amelia laughed, and just like that, they were out the door, their voices fading down the sidewalk as they argued about which store they'd visit first. Silver Creek Mall was only a short walk away, a familiar destination for kids their age. Built in the early 1970s, it was the pride of Halcyon, a modest indoor mall with polished tile floors, warm yellow lighting, and storefronts decorated with bold signage and plastic plants. On Saturdays, it was busy but not overwhelming. Parents browsed department stores, teenagers lingered near record shops, and younger kids wandered in loose packs, enjoying a taste of independence. Amelia and Lucas arrived just before noon, the automatic doors whooshing open as they stepped inside. They shared a pretzel from the food counter, laughed at a display of novelty toys, and spent too long pressing their faces against the glass of an electronics store, staring at devices they didn't understand but desperately wanted. They moved easily through the mall, comfortable and relaxed, unaware of the eyes tracking them. Dennis Cole, a part-time security guard, noticed the man almost immediately. He stood out, not because he looked threatening, but because he didn't seem to belong. He was in his mid-30s, neatly dressed, with a calm, almost rehearsed demeanor. Slung over his shoulder was a portable tape recorder, the kind journalists used for interviews. Dennis watched as the man lingered near clusters of children, never too close, never obvious, just close enough to observe. At one point, Dennis considered approaching him, asking if he needed help, but the man moved on before he could. The man's name was Gideon Voss. Amelia and Lucas didn't notice him at first. They were too busy debating whether they could afford a small toy from the novelty shop. Gideon approached casually, smiling, crouching slightly so he didn't tower over them. He asked if they liked music, told them he was recording sounds for a project, and asked if they'd like to help. His voice was calm, friendly, practiced. Lucas was intrigued immediately. Amelia hesitated, instinct flickering, but Gideon didn't push. He joked, he laughed. He made it feel harmless. Witnesses would later recall seeing the children near the toy store entrance, Lucas holding Amelia's hand as Gideon gestured toward the parking lot, explaining that his car was just outside and the recording equipment worked better away from the noise. No one thought to intervene. No one screamed. No one ran. It looked ordinary. That was the most terrifying part. That was the last confirmed sighting of Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart. By late afternoon, Eleanor knew something was wrong. The kids should have been home hours ago. She called the mall, then Daniel, then neighbors. Panic spread quickly through Halcyon, the kind that tightens your chest and makes every sound feel too loud. Daniel drove to the mall himself, running through stores, asking clerks if they'd seen the kids. No one had. The security desk took a report. By early evening, the police were called. Detective Roy Henderson was assigned the case just after 7 p.m. Henderson was experienced, methodical, and respected, the kind of detective who believed patience and persistence solved cases, not luck. He arrived at Silver Creek Mall after closing, walking the same paths Amelia and Lucas had walked earlier that day. He spoke to Dennis Cole, who mentioned the man with the tape recorder. The description was vague but troubling. Henderson took note. Search teams combed the surrounding area through the night. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers searched wooded paths and drainage ditches. Parents stood together in the mall parking lot, clinging to each other, watching headlights sweep through the darkness. By morning, hope had started to fray. Over the next few days, Henderson built a timeline. Witnesses came forward slowly, memories imperfect and fragmented. Helen Morton, a local resident, recalled seeing a man speaking with 2 children near the mall entrance. She remembered the tape recorder clearly. Another witness mentioned a car idling near the parking lot exit. Henderson felt the shape of something forming, but it wasn't enough. Gideon Voss was located 3 days later. He lived alone, worked sporadically, and had no prior criminal record. When questioned, he was polite, cooperative, and unsettlingly calm. He admitted being at the mall, admitted speaking with children, but denied taking them anywhere. He agreed to a polygraph. He failed. Every key question triggered deception indicators. Did you leave the mall with the children? No. Did you harm them? No. Did you know where they were now? No. The machine told a different story. Henderson believed it. He felt it in his gut. This was their man, but belief wasn't evidence. Voss's lawyer dismantled the case methodically. There were no witnesses who saw him force the children. No physical evidence. No vehicle registration tying him to the scene. A co-worker claimed Voss was seen later that afternoon, miles away. The Crown declined to charge. Halcyon reacted with grief and anger. Vigils were held outside Silver Creek Mall, candles flickering beneath handmade signs bearing Amelia and Lucas's faces. Eleanor and Daniel stood together at the front every night, hollow-eyed, begging anyone with information to come forward. The media covered the story briefly, then moved on. Leads dried up. Weeks passed, then months. By 1980, the case was officially classified as cold. Detective Henderson didn't stop working it, but he knew the truth. Without new evidence, without a confession, without bodies, the case would drift. Files would be archived. Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart would become names spoken only on anniversaries. Before shelving the file, Henderson wrote one final note in the margin of the Voss's profile. Primary suspect, unresolved. He underlined it twice. Halcyon never recovered. Parents stopped letting kids walk alone. Mall security was increased. Trust eroded quietly, invisibly. Eleanor Dawson never changed the children's rooms. Daniel Hart attended every vigil until his health began to fail. The town moved forward, but the wound stayed open. And if you're listening to this story right now, decades later, understand this. Cases like this don't stay alive because of institutions. They stay alive because people refuse to forget, because someone chooses to care, because someone presses subscribe instead of scrolling past, because attention is sometimes the only justice left. If you want stories like Amelia and Lucas's to keep being told, if you believe forgotten victims deserve voices, then don't just watch. Stay, subscribe. Because silence is what cases like this depend on, and remembering is the only thing that ever breaks it. By the spring of 1981, 3 years had passed since Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart vanished from Silver Creek Mall, and the town of Halcyon, Ontario, no longer looked like the place it once had. On the surface, life continued the way it always had. Stores opened and closed. Children walked to school. Snow fell in winter and melted into muddy streets every March. But underneath it all, something had shifted permanently. The disappearance of 2 children had left a scar that time refused to heal. And while the case technically remained open, everyone knew the truth. No one wanted to say out loud. The investigation had stalled. Leads had dried up. And the man many believed was responsible had slipped quietly out of reach. Gideon Voss left Ontario in early 1981. There was no announcement, no trail of sirens, no dramatic moment where anyone realized he was gone. He simply disappeared the way men like him always do, slowly and deliberately, step by careful step. His rental apartment was vacated without notice. His employer received a short phone call explaining he wouldn't be coming back. His name stopped appearing in local records, and by the time anyone thought to look closely, there was nothing left to find. No forwarding address, no obvious destination, just absence. Later, investigators would piece together that Voss crossed provincial lines sometime in February, driving west through Manitoba, then Alberta, and finally settling in British Columbia. But in 1981, no one was tracking him that closely anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because the system had already begun to move on. In British Columbia, Gideon Voss stopped being Gideon Voss. By the time he reached the outskirts of Kamloops, he had a new name, Marcus Hale. The paperwork wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. In the early 1980s, changing your identity didn't require the sophistication it does today. A few forms, a handful of unverifiable details, and a willingness to lie calmly when asked questions. Hale claimed he'd grown up in foster care. No family, no records worth checking. He was polite, soft-spoken, unremarkable in the way that allows men to disappear into plain sight. Over the next 2 decades, he worked a series of jobs that required little scrutiny. Warehouse labor, maintenance work, janitorial contracts, temporary positions that came and went without leaving much behind. He rented small basement suites, kept to himself, and avoided forming close relationships. Neighbors would later describe him as quiet, forgettable, the kind of man you might nod to in passing but never really see. But what people didn't know was that Marcus Hale was living a carefully constructed performance. Behind closed doors, he kept fragments of a past he refused to let go of. Old newspaper clippings folded until the edges were soft, a shoebox filled with items that had no innocent explanation. He followed news coverage obsessively, particularly anything related to missing children or cold cases. And every year, around late March, he would become more withdrawn than usual, taking time off work or claiming illness. No one connected the pattern. No one suspected that the man quietly living among them had once been the focus of a desperate investigation in a town thousands of miles away. Back in Halcyon, Amelia Dawson and Daniel Hart were learning what it meant to live in the long aftermath of loss. The early years after Amelia and Lucas disappeared had been dominated by hope, frantic and exhausting. Every phone call could be the one. Every reported sighting sent adrenaline through their veins. They traveled when they could, followed tips that led nowhere, and sat through interviews that asked the same questions over and over again. What were the children wearing? Who did they trust? Had they ever talked about strangers? Over time, hope began to change shape. It became heavier, quieter, more painful to carry. Eleanor kept Amelia's bedroom exactly the way it had been the day she left. The books on her shelf remained untouched. The small desk by the window still held unfinished homework. Daniel, on the other hand, couldn't stand the silence. He spent longer hours at work, volunteered for overtime, anything to avoid coming home to a house that felt too large and too empty. Their relationship survived, but it was never the same. Grief doesn't just take what you love, it reshapes everything around it. Conversations became careful, tiptoeing around memories that hurt too much to say out loud. Family gatherings were strained. Holidays were the worst. Every Christmas brought the same quiet ritual. 2 gifts wrapped and placed under the tree, unopened, donated weeks later because neither Eleanor nor Daniel could bring themselves to stop the tradition. Friends tried to help at first, bringing casseroles offering company, suggesting therapy. But as years passed and nothing changed, support thinned. People didn't know what to say anymore, and eventually they stopped trying. The town of Halcyon carried its own version of the burden. Parents became more cautious than paranoid. Children were no longer allowed to walk to the mall alone. Playdates were supervised, curfews tightened. A generation grew up hearing the same warning whispered again and again. Be careful. Stay close. Don't talk to strangers. Amelia and Lucas became cautionary tales, their names invoked as reminders of how quickly everything could go wrong. But as time moved forward, even those warnings faded. New families moved in. Older residents passed away. By the late 1990s, there were police officers working in Halcyon who hadn't even been born when the children vanished. Inside the Halcyon Police Department, the case slowly slipped into dormancy. The file was thick, heavy with reports, witness statements, and unanswered questions. It was moved from active investigations to long-term storage, then finally to the cold case archives. The label on the box was simple: Dawson Hart Disappearance, 1978. Every few years someone would pull it out, usually prompted by a documentary, an anniversary, or a new missing persons case elsewhere that felt eerily familiar. But without new evidence, there was little to do. The witnesses had aged or died. Memories had blurred, and the man once considered the most likely suspect was nowhere to be found. Detective Roy Henderson retired in 1989. On his last day, he requested one thing. He wanted to take copies of his notes home with him. The department allowed it, seeing no harm in indulging an old detective who had never quite let go of one case. Henderson spent years revisiting the file in his spare time, convinced that something had been missed. He believed Gideon Voss had gotten away with murder, and that belief never softened with age. When Henderson died in 2002, his personal files were returned to the department, boxed up and added back into storage. No one read them closely. No one noticed the margin notes, the underlined phrases, the quiet insistence scribbled in pen decades earlier. Primary suspect, identity unresolved. Time continued its slow march forward. Eleanor Dawson's hair turned gray. Daniel Hart's shoulders stooped. Their lives narrowed around routine, grief becoming something they carried rather than something that consumed them. They attended every vigil. They spoke at every anniversary. They kept Amelia and Lucas alive through stories, through memory, through refusal to let their names disappear completely. But privately, they prepared themselves for the possibility that they would never know what happened, that the world might move on without answers, that justice might never come. Then, in 2018, something changed. Detective Evelyn Cross had been with the Halcyon Police Department for 12 years when she was assigned to the Cold Case Unit, a small, underfunded division housed in a converted storage area in the basement. Cross was methodical, patient, and deeply uncomfortable with unresolved endings. She had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession, a quality that made her both respected and quietly resented by colleagues who preferred clearer victories. When she took over the cold case archives, she made one promise to herself. She would treat every file as if the people inside it were still waiting. The Dawson Hart file was one of the first she opened. She spent days reading through it, page by page, absorbing the timeline, the witness accounts, the missed opportunities. What struck her most wasn't what was in the file, but what wasn't. There were gaps, assumptions made without follow-up, leads abandoned because technology at the time hadn't been advanced enough to pursue them. And then there were the notes. Henderson's handwriting was cramped but deliberate, his suspicion of Gideon Voss appearing again and again. Cross noticed something others hadn't bothered to question. Voss had never been conclusively eliminated. He had simply vanished. Cross began cross-referencing the name Gideon Voss with national databases. There were no recent records, no death certificate, no arrests, no employment history past 1981. For most investigators, that would have been the end of the road. But Cross wasn't satisfied. She expanded her search, looking for variations, aliases, name changes filed during the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was tedious work, requiring hours of manual searches through digitized archives. And then, buried in a provincial record system, she found something that made her stop. A name change filed in British Columbia in 1981. Marcus Hale, former name Gideon Voss. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was something. Cross didn't celebrate. She didn't announce her discovery. She did what experienced investigators do when they think they might finally be onto something real. She slowed down. She pulled everything she could on Marcus Hale. Addresses, employment records, vehicle registrations, patterns. She began to see the outline of a man who had lived carefully, deliberately avoiding attention. A man who moved just often enough to avoid forming roots. A man whose life, on paper, looked almost intentionally blank. By the fall of 2018, Cross knew she couldn't do this alone. She assembled a small team, choosing people she trusted not just with the work, but with the weight of it. Detective Samuel Torres, a veteran investigator with a background in financial crimes and digital records. Constable Mia Harper, younger, sharp, and relentless when it came to data analysis. Together, they reopened the Dawson Hart case quietly, without fanfare, without public announcements. They didn't want attention yet. They wanted answers. The first thing they did was re-examine everything that had once been dismissed as inconclusive. Old witness statements were digitized and reanalyzed. Timelines were reconstructed using modern mapping tools. Torres focused on tracing Voss's movements after 1978, while Harper began cataloging every known alias, address, and employer connected to Marcus Hale. What emerged was unsettling. Hale had lived within miles of at least 3 other unsolved disappearances over the years. Nothing that could be charged, nothing that could be proven, but enough to raise the kind of questions that keep detectives awake at night. For Eleanor Dawson and Daniel Hart, the phone call came on a quiet afternoon. Detective Cross didn't promise answers. She didn't offer hope she couldn't guarantee. She simply told them the truth. The case was being reviewed. New information had surfaced, and for the first time in decades there was movement. Eleanor cried after the call ended, not out of relief, but out of fear. Hope, she had learned, could hurt just as much as despair. As this investigation begins to turn, as old names resurface and buried truths start to push their way back into the light, there's something worth asking. Do you think cases like this ever truly go cold, or are they just waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right technology to bring them back? I want you to think about that, and if this story is making you feel something, if it's stirring questions or memories or anger, share your thoughts in the comments. Conversations like these matter. They keep stories like Amelia's and Lucas's alive. By the end of 2018, Detective Evelyn Cross knew she was standing at the edge of something that could change everything. Gideon Voss hadn't vanished. He had reinvented himself. And if Cross was right, if Marcus Hale was truly the same man who had walked out of Silver Creek Mall 40 years earlier, then the silence that had surrounded this case for decades was about to be broken. What came next would require patience, precision, and a willingness to disturb graves both literal and figurative. The cold case was no longer dormant. It was waking up. It had been decades since anyone had seen Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart, 2 bright, lively children who vanished from Silver Creek Mall in 1978. Families had waited, towns had grieved, and for nearly 40 years, their fate remained a haunting mystery. But now, nearly 4 decades later, the pieces were finally coming together. Detective Evelyn Cross sat in a dimly lit office in British Columbia, hunched over a series of maps, old files, and her laptop screen. Every address she traced for Gideon Voss, the man who had disappeared so completely, led her closer to a quiet neighborhood in Cedar Ridge. Voss was no longer Voss. He had assumed a new identity decades ago. He was Marcus Hale now. Cross rubbed her eyes, staring at the images on her screen. There it was. A modest house, well kept, but surrounded by an air of secrecy. Mail piled on one side, a car parked slightly too far from the curb, blinds drawn during the day. Cross's team had been tracking Hale for weeks, carefully collecting information from utility records, old employment histories, and recent purchases. Every step was meticulous, deliberate. No room for error after all these years. Samuel Torres, her partner, leaned against the doorway with a map in hand. Evelyn, I double-checked the soil samples from the surrounding area. They match the types we found on the original 1978 evidence. Could be a coincidence, but the likelihood is extremely low. Cross exhaled slowly. No coincidences this late in the game, Sam. Not after 42 years. Let's start coordinating a sweep. I want this done cleanly, efficiently. We don't need any surprises. As the team prepared, Constable Mia Harper walked in with a folder clutched in her hands. Evelyn, look at this. There's a receipt for a storage unit in the area from 1991. Marcus Hale's name. Could indicate he was hiding something for longer than we thought. Cross scanned the paper, her pulse quickening. Every lead, no matter how small, was a thread that could unravel decades of mystery. The next morning, surveillance units were in place. Drones hovered in the sky, cameras positioned to catch every entrance and exit. Cross's team stayed hidden, blending into the neighborhood, while detectives observed Hale's movements. He emerged from his house briefly to retrieve a package, unaware of the watchful eyes trained on him. The tension was palpable. Years of waiting, decades of frustration, and countless dead ends were all building to this moment. Inside the house, Hale's life seemed ordinary on the surface. Furniture neatly arranged, kitchen spotless, personal artifacts tucked away carefully. But Cross's team had learned from history. Appearances could be deceiving. With a warrant in hand, they coordinated a synchronized entry. SWAT officers moved in quietly, the element of surprise crucial to prevent destruction of evidence. Hale opened the door himself, surprised but compliant. He offered no resistance, no fight, simply stared blankly as officers moved past him, securing the home. Neighbors watched in disbelief. Marcus Hale had been one of them for nearly 4 decades, a quiet, unassuming man who nodded politely when passing by. And yet, the reality that this very man could be responsible for the disappearance of 2 children decades prior left them stunned. A few took out phones, capturing the arrest. Whispers filled the air. Children watched from windows. Adults shook their heads in horror. Meanwhile, Cross's team began cataloging and securing evidence. Hale's basement contained items that immediately drew attention. A small chest, carefully hidden under old blankets, containing children's clothing. Tiny shoes, a pink sweater, a denim jacket, exactly matching descriptions from 1978. Dusty newspapers with front-page articles about Amelia and Lucas were stacked neatly. And then there was the tape recorder, yellowed with age, the same type described by witnesses at Silver Creek Mall decades before. Cross's stomach tightened. "It's all here," she whispered to Torres. "Every single piece." Forensic experts were brought in immediately. Dr. Aaron Kim and Jordan Lee, specialists in cold case analysis, carefully examined the remains discovered in Hale's backyard, preserved for decades under layers of soil. The DNA testing process was painstaking, but the results confirmed what the investigators had feared and hoped for. The remains were indeed Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart. Trace evidence linked the clothing, tape recorder, and soil directly to Hale's property. The forensic connection was undeniable, the chain of evidence unbroken across 4 decades. Back in Halcyon, Ontario, Eleanor Dawson and Daniel Hart received the news in separate locations. Their hands trembled as they listened to Cross on the phone, detailing the discovery. "Your children, they've been found," Cross said, her voice steady but gentle. Silence followed on the other end, broken only by the quiet sobs of parents who had mourned without closure for over 40 years. The weight of grief, longing, and hope, now mingled with a painful relief, was overwhelming. Across the town, neighbors and friends shared the news cautiously, unable to believe that after decades of uncertainty, answers had finally arrived. The media quickly picked up the story. News crews flocked to Cedar Ridge and Halcyon, cameras flashing, reporters speaking in hushed tones about the unprecedented breakthrough. Hale's arrest was no longer a local story, it was national news. For families who had grown up with the mystery, for townspeople who remembered the missing children, it was almost surreal to see justice arrive so late. Some were skeptical, asking how a man could evade law enforcement for so long, but the evidence spoke for itself. In Cedar Ridge, as officers documented every inch of Hale's property, Cross paused in the basement, staring at the chest of clothing. She imagined Amelia and Lucas playing in their yard, walking hand in hand to the mall, their laughter echoing in the past. "We failed them for decades," she murmured. "But at least now they're not forgotten." Her words were heavy with guilt and determination, the same emotions felt by countless investigators over the years. It was that sense of accountability, that relentless pursuit of justice, that had finally led to this moment. As the investigation continued, families were flown to Cedar Ridge under supervision to view personal effects, carefully catalogued and photographed. Eleanor Dawson held her daughter's sweater in her hands, feeling the fabric, imagining the small figure who had worn it. Daniel Hart sat quietly, tears streaming, tracing the outline of his son's small shoes. Memories flooded back. Morning breakfasts, school bag preparations, laughter in the hallway. Those moments, frozen in time since 1978, were now tangible again, bittersweet reminders of lives stolen. Cross coordinated the forensic analysis with meticulous care. Each fiber, each soil sample, each artifact was photographed, catalogued, and cross-referenced with decades-old reports from Halcyon Police Department. It was a painstaking process, but essential. Any oversight could jeopardize a case that had already taken 42 years to bring to light. Detectives Samuel Torres and Mia Harper documented every discovery, while Cross maintained communication with families, balancing transparency with care. The emotional toll of the investigation weighed heavily on everyone involved. Torres confided in Cross one evening, "I keep seeing their faces. I keep thinking about how many times the town moved on, and how their parents never could. It's like every step we take is making up for decades of lost time." Cross nodded silently. She had thought about it too, often late at night, imagining the laughter of Amelia and Lucas, wondering how things could have been different, wishing she could have prevented decades of pain. As Hale was placed in custody, the realization hit hard. The man responsible for so much suffering had lived a quiet life, seemingly ordinary for 42 years. He had passed unnoticed by neighbors, by colleagues, by a justice system that had lacked the tools and foresight to hold him accountable. Now, every action, every decision, every tiny detail would be scrutinized to ensure nothing was missed. Evidence collected at the property, the forensic results, and decades-old witness accounts combined to form an airtight case that would stand in court. The media coverage intensified. Social media exploded with reactions: disbelief, relief, outrage. People shared stories of the children, their lives, their absence, and the decades of waiting for justice. Parents wrote heartfelt messages about the fear and hope of losing children. Others questioned how someone could live undetected for so long and what it meant for child safety in society. Amidst this, a subtle, emotional call to action emerged for the audience. These stories matter. Every missing child is not just a statistic, but a life, a family, a community forever altered. Viewers were left with the unspoken responsibility to pay attention, to care, to never turn away from the pain of those who cannot speak for themselves. For Cross, the breakthrough was bittersweet. The relief of closure for families was tempered by the haunting realization that Amelia and Lucas's lives had been stolen forever. But it also reinforced the importance of persistence, of refusing to let cases die. If we stop looking, if we forget, then they truly are lost, she told Torres quietly as they left Hale's property. We owe it to them, to every family still waiting, to keep pushing, keep asking, keep seeking the truth. Back in Halcyon, Eleanor Dawson and Daniel Hart prepared for memorial arrangements. They wanted something simple, something that honored the children they had loved fiercely and lost tragically. Friends and neighbors volunteered, and the community began to gather once again, not for fear, but for remembrance. Candles were lit, photos displayed, and soft voices murmured prayers. In many ways, this was the first true opportunity to say goodbye, to acknowledge both the pain and the persistence of hope that had finally led to answers. The children's story began appearing on national news segments, podcasts, and online forums devoted to true crime. Investigative journalists recounted the meticulous work of Evelyn Cross and her team, emphasizing the perseverance required to bring decades-old cases to resolution. Listeners and viewers across the country were captivated not just by the mystery, but by the human element. The families, the investigators, the community who refused to forget. And yet, even as the story spread, a profound question lingered. How many other children, how many other families were still waiting? Hale's arrest, while monumental, was a reminder that time could be both an ally and an enemy. The missing, the forgotten, the cases deemed cold, each one carried a weight, and the responsibility to act rested with those willing to see through the pain, to fight for truth long after the initial grief had dulled. In the quiet moments as Cross and her team filed reports and prepared for court proceedings, they allowed themselves a small measure of satisfaction. Not for the crime itself, no one could ever celebrate such tragedy, but for the fact that justice, however delayed, was possible. That Amelia and Lucas would not be forgotten. That their story could finally be told with the dignity it deserved. It was a somber yet powerful victory, a reminder that dedication, empathy, and relentless pursuit of the truth could bring light to even the darkest of cases. The investigation was far from over. The trial awaited. But for the families, the community, and the investigators who had never stopped hoping, the discovery represented the first step toward closure. And to those watching, reading, listening, remember this. Every child matters. Every family waiting for answers deserves to be heard. If Amelia and Lucas's story moves you, if it weighs on your heart that a man could evade justice for decades, let that feeling compel action. Stay informed, share these stories, advocate for those who cannot speak, and never underestimate the power of persistence. Because in the end, silence and inaction allow darkness to thrive, but attention, care, and determination bring justice to the forgotten. The courtroom in Kelowna, British Columbia, was packed. A dense mix of journalists, townspeople, true crime enthusiasts, and, most importantly, the families who had waited decades for justice. The air felt heavy, a mixture of tension, anticipation, and the echoes of grief that had never fully faded. At the front, Marcus Hale, once Gideon Voss, sat rigidly, flanked by his defense attorneys. His face was pale, his frame smaller than it had been during the arrest, yet his expression remained unreadable, as if the decades had hardened him into a shell impervious to emotion. Across the room, Detective Evelyn Cross sat with her team, arms folded, a quiet focus etched into every line of her face. She had carried this case through years of frustration, dead ends, and sleepless nights, and now the culmination of all that work would finally play out in front of 12 ordinary people who held the power to deliver justice. The judge entered, rapping the gavel sharply. "This court will come to order," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the audience. "The case before us involves the disappearance and murder of 2 children, Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart, in Halcyon, Ontario, in 1978. The trial will determine the guilt or innocence of Marcus Hale, also known as Gideon Voss. Our counsel ready to proceed?" Vanessa Langford, the Crown Attorney, stood with deliberate calm. She glanced at the jury before beginning, her voice steady but charged with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen, this trial is not about speculation. It is about 2 children whose lives were stolen, and about the relentless pursuit of justice for a family who has waited over 40 years for answers. Amelia Dawson, 12 years old, and Lucas Hart, 10, disappeared from a shopping trip on March the 25th, 1978. For 42 years, their families lived with unanswered questions, pain that no words could lessen, and a void that would never truly close. That void ends now." The opening statements continued, laying out the timeline of events with precision. The children leaving their homes, the mundane joy of that morning, and the fateful walk to Silver Creek Mall. Cross had gathered every witness, every fragment of evidence, every overlooked note from the original investigation. Langford outlined the path that had led them here, the missed leads, the polygraph failures, the decades of Voss's illusion, and the meticulous work that traced him to his current identity. The jury listened intently, some already blinking back tears, imagining the anguish endured by Eleanor Dawson and Daniel Hart, who sat silently in the gallery, hands tightly clasped. As Langford transitioned into presenting the case, she introduced witnesses who had been integral to the investigation. Detective Cross rose first. "I began reviewing this case in 2018, she testified, her voice unwavering. "I went through the original files line by line. I found an overlooked note from 1978 that hinted at Gideon Voss's movements and a possible pattern of behavior. Tracing his aliases, past residences, and employment records allowed us to locate him in British Columbia, where he has lived under the name Marcus Hale for decades." The jury absorbed every word. The narrative moved seamlessly between past and present. The children laughing as they walked to the mall, the fleeting moment of curiosity that led them to follow a stranger, and the painstaking decades of investigation that finally brought the truth to light. Cross described the coordinated operation that led to Hale's arrest, detailing how SWAT teams had carefully executed the search, how evidence was recovered, and how forensic specialists meticulously analyzed every piece of trace material, every soil sample, every fiber, and every personal item connected to the 1978 crime. Dr. Aaron Kim and forensic analyst Jordan Lee testified next, presenting the findings with precision. The remains, recovered from Mr. Hale's property, match the dental records of Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart, Dr. Kim stated plainly. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the injuries reported in the original investigation. Trace evidence from the recovered clothing and personal items links directly to this property. The courtroom was silent. Not a pen moved, not a single cough disturbed the room. The weight of decades-old grief, compounded by the certainty of evidence, hung over everyone like a heavy fog. Langford let the silence settle before turning to the families. Eleanor Dawson and Daniel Hart, who had spent their lives carrying unbearable uncertainty, were asked to recount their experiences. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke. "Every day we woke up hoping for answers. Every day we wondered if someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. Every day we feared the worst but hoped for the best. And for 42 years the pain never let up," Daniel Hart added, his eyes moist. "We lived in a town where people whispered, where children's absences were a constant reminder of fear. The holidays were hardest. Every birthday, every school milestone, we felt the emptiness. Today, we finally know the truth. And yet, nothing can bring them back." The prosecution presented the forensic evidence in detail, showing photographs of the recovered clothing, the children's toys, and the meticulously preserved items from Hale's property. Each image elicited reactions from the jury and audience, an emotional reminder of the tangible reality of the crime. The pink sweater Amelia had worn, the sneakers Lucas adored, the toys they had carried that fateful day. Every item told a story, a connection to lives violently interrupted. The defense attempted to interject, presenting character witnesses who described Hale as quiet, unassuming, and untroubled by past neighbors. Richard Palmer, Hale's attorney, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing in front of the jury, "this case is built on fragments. There is no direct proof that my client committed these acts. Consider reasonable doubt. Would you convict someone based on what might be interpreted as coincidences stretched over decades?" The jury remained impassive. Cross's earlier testimonies had meticulously tied every piece of evidence together. DNA matches, trace materials, and Hale's known history left no plausible alternative. Even the defense's attempts to sow doubt seemed to falter under the weight of 42 years of accumulated investigation. Langford returned to the floor for closing arguments, her voice rising with intensity. "This is not about speculation. It is about real children who existed, who loved life, who trusted adults to keep them safe, and who were stolen from this world. This is about the parents who lived a lifetime of grief, and this is about a man who, despite countless opportunities to be caught, evaded justice for decades. You have before you a case built with diligence, precision, and undeniable evidence. You have the power to honor the memory of Amelia and Lucas. You have the power to ensure justice is finally served." Cross felt a lump in her throat as Langford's words reverberated through the courtroom. Every investigator who had worked the case, every family member who had held hope in the darkness, had contributed to this moment. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, the longest 6 hours many in the courtroom had ever experienced. Outside, in the waiting area, families gripped each other's hands, whispering words of encouragement, silently wishing for closure. Finally, the jury returned. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder in the case of Amelia Dawson, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, the foreperson replied. A collective breath exhaled in relief. Tears streamed freely from Eleanor Dawson's eyes. Daniel Hart buried his face in his hands. And those who had followed the case for decades felt a wave of vindication. The judge repeated the question for Lucas Hart's murder. Guilty, came the answer again. The courtroom erupted, a mixture of sobs, murmurs, and claps. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing as family members hugged tightly. Haley remained unmoved, staring straight ahead, the years of deception and illusion etched into his hardened expression. The judge's gavel brought order. Marcus Hale, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Sentencing will occur at a later date. Until then, you will remain in custody. Guards approached Hale and escorted him out, his silence unbroken. In the gallery, Cross and Langford exchanged a glance. Justice had been served, but the emotional toll lingered. Weeks later, on sentencing day, the courtroom was again full. Hale, now frailer, stood before the judge. The prosecution presented a detailed account of the pain inflicted, the decades of suffering endured by the families, and the calculated nature of Hale's illusion. This court cannot erase 42 years of agony, the judge said, nor can it restore lives stolen. However, the law allows for the most severe consequences in light of the evidence. Marcus Hale is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The families felt a mixture of grief and relief. The sentence was severe, but the truth that the man responsible would no longer be free provided a sense of closure. Outside, the community reflected on the decades of fear and uncertainty that had shadowed their lives. Vigils and memorials continued at Silver Creek Mall and in the town of Halcyon, honoring Amelia and Lucas, reminding all who remembered that children must be protected, and that justice, no matter how long delayed, is worth pursuing. Cross later reflected in an interview, her voice quiet but firm, I often wonder what it would be like if every investigator refused to let a case die, if every witness spoke up, if every detail was pursued relentlessly. These children waited 42 years for answers. No family should ever have to wait that long. So, I ask you, if you were in a position to make a difference, would you act? Would you speak up, investigate, and refuse to let another child's story fade into silence? Her question lingered, a direct challenge to every viewer. The story of Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart was a reminder. Innocence can be stolen, time can be cruel, but persistence, vigilance, and courage can restore balance. Justice is not always swift, but it is achievable. In the quiet of Halcyon, the families visited the graves, now adorned with flowers, photographs, and small tokens left by strangers who had followed the case. The memorials at the mall and around town became permanent reminders that Amelia and Lucas were more than victims. They were children who mattered, whose lives, however brief, left an indelible mark. The community, once fractured by fear, slowly found unity in remembrance, and the shared understanding that even after decades, the truth could prevail. Detective Evelyn Cross returned to her office, reviewing old files and planning the next cold case she would pursue. The Lyons case had set a precedent, showing that persistence can pierce through time, that no crime is too old to solve, and that every victim deserves to be remembered. She placed a small photo of Amelia and Lucas on her desk, a personal reminder that behind every case number is a human story, and that justice, no matter how delayed, is never meaningless. The town of Halcyon, Ontario, had changed in many ways since the arrest and conviction of Marcus Hale. Streets were quieter, children played in the parks with parents watching more closely, and the small community carried with it a sense of shared memory that was both heavy and healing. The Silver Creek Mall, where Amelia Dawson and Lucas Hart had been taken decades ago, now bore a plaque near its main entrance, a bronze tribute etched with the names of the children, their dates of birth and disappearance, and a simple phrase, Loved, remembered, never forgotten. The unveiling ceremony had drawn hundreds, from parents of young children to elderly residents who had lived through the harrowing search of 1978. It was a quiet triumph for the community, a tangible symbol that the children's story had not been erased. Every March 25th, families returned to that spot, lighting candles and leaving small toys, handwritten notes, or photographs of the children. People who had never known Amelia or Lucas personally felt a connection, an invisible thread linking them to the events that had defined the town's collective consciousness for over 4 decades. Amelia Dawson, Lucas's mother, was present at nearly every memorial. Each time she carried a bouquet of white lilies, careful to place them neatly in front of the plaque, and each year she whispered Amelia's name softly as if expecting an answer. Daniel Hart, Lucas's father, often stood beside her, arms folded, watching the younger children of Halcyon play across the square, knowing that his own son never had the chance to grow up in the same way. Their grief had become a quiet, persistent shadow, and yet they endured, finding purpose in remembrance and advocacy. Felix Dawson, Amelia's cousin, had taken it upon himself to organize the town's remembrance gatherings, coordinating with local authorities and schools to ensure that each year the story of the children was shared with the younger generations. He arranged for small educational sessions about child safety, incorporating lessons learned from the 1978 tragedy, and spoke openly about the importance of vigilance and community support. The Silver Creek Mall plaque was more than a symbol. It was an anchor for these educational initiatives. Families who attended were encouraged to share memories, to write letters, or simply to stand in quiet reflection, teaching children empathy and the significance of standing against injustice. Jennifer Hart, Lucas's cousin, had spent the years after the trial documenting every detail of the case, not just as a historical record, but as a way to process her own grief. Her book, A Never Forgotten, Amelia and Lucas, was published in 2022 and quickly became a bestseller in Canada. She recounted not only the events of that day and the painstaking investigation that followed, but also the human side of the tragedy. The parents who never stopped searching. The neighbors who held vigil for weeks. The children who grew up carrying an invisible burden of fear and loss. Interviews with her reflected her ongoing dedication to ensuring that Amelia and Lucas's lives were remembered not merely as victims, but as vibrant, imaginative children whose potential had been stolen. She traveled to schools, universities, and community centers, holding discussions about child safety, the persistence of justice, and the importance of advocacy. Every time she spoke, she made sure to ask her audience, if you knew something, if you saw something suspicious, would you act? Would you ensure the next child is safe? Because silence can cost a lifetime. Across the country, the impact of the Halcyon case had ripple effects. Other cold cases, some decades old, were reopened using the methods pioneered by Detective Evelyn Cross and her team. Archives were revisited, trace evidence reanalyzed with modern DNA technology, and investigative techniques were shared among provincial and federal units. Families who had given up hope began to hear new leads, find closure, or finally understand the fate of their loved ones. In Alberta, a teenager missing since 1983 was located using forensic analysis similar to the one that confirmed Amelia and Lucas. In Manitoba, a young woman who disappeared in the 1990s was identified through a combination of old witness reports and DNA. Each success served as a reminder. Persistence could overcome decades of silence, and justice, though delayed, remained possible. Detective Evelyn Cross continued her work, taking on new cases but always reflecting on the Halcyon investigation as a cornerstone of her career. In interviews, she spoke not just about the technical aspects of solving cold cases, but also about the human element. It's never just evidence, it's people, families, children who were loved and who deserved protection. That is what drives me, and that is what drives everyone who refuses to give up on the truth. Cross had become a mentor to young investigators, leading workshops on cold case methodology, ethical handling of evidence, and community engagement. Her team included officers she had trained personally, who now approached unsolved cases with the same dedication and compassion she had instilled. In Halcyon, the community continued to heal in small, tangible ways. Local schools incorporated child safety programs inspired by Amelia and Lucas's story. Public seminars were held about the importance of reporting suspicious activity, and town council meetings discussed ways to improve neighborhood security. Community members who had been neighbors to the children or involved in the original search worked alongside younger residents, teaching lessons in vigilance, empathy, and the collective responsibility of a tight-knit town. Even something as simple as maintaining the grounds around the memorial plaque became a symbol of shared purpose, of a community unwilling to let tragedy fade into anonymity. Amelia Dawson and Daniel Hart took a more personal approach to advocacy, meeting with policymakers to improve child protection measures and lobbying for better resources for law enforcement agencies handling missing children. They shared their story widely, emphasizing that one case could illuminate systemic gaps that might prevent future tragedies. Felix Dawson joined them on several occasions, leading workshops for local law enforcement and community groups on recognizing early warning signs, interviewing witnesses, and preserving evidence in ways that could withstand decades-long investigations. Their combined efforts were deeply personal. They carried not only grief, but a moral imperative to ensure that what happened to Amelia and Lucas could never be repeated. At home, Jennifer Hart's book had also spurred personal reflection and growth. She worked closely with advocacy groups, created a small foundation in Amelia and Lucas's memory, and established scholarships for students pursuing careers in criminology, forensic science, and social work. The foundation also supported families of missing children, providing emotional and financial assistance during long, painful searches. Each lecture, each seminar, each scholarship awarded was a tribute to the children who had been taken, a way to keep their story alive and their memory honored. The grave sites themselves had become quiet centers of reflection. On warm spring evenings, visitors could be seen leaving small objects that reflected Amelia and Lucas's personalities. A set of colored pencils, a small book, a toy car. Photographs of the children, Amelia reading a favorite story, Lucas playing in the yard, were occasionally left behind. The town had collectively adopted these gestures as acts of remembrance, understanding that healing was not only private, but communal. Children visiting the memorial learned the power of memory, the significance of empathy, and the responsibility of never ignoring those in need. Detective Cross, during her reflective walks around the Halcyon streets, often considered the intangible effects of the investigation. She thought about the parents, the children in the town who had grown up in the shadow of fear, and the lessons learned from meticulous attention to detail, persistence, and ethical commitment. She also considered the larger narrative, that solving one case, however tragic, could spark a wave of awareness, reform, and hope. Her mind often wandered to what Amelia and Lucas's lives could have been. A sunny afternoon spent reading in the park, a first school dance, graduation ceremonies. She couldn't give them these experiences, but through advocacy, remembrance, and justice, she had ensured that their story mattered, and that they would never be forgotten. Halcyon's annual memorial gatherings grew in scale over the years. People traveled from neighboring towns, bringing flowers, candles, and letters of remembrance. Community leaders spoke about vigilance and the importance of not turning a blind eye to injustice. Law enforcement officers often joined, sharing insights about cold case investigations, forensic advancements, and the value of community support. The events were both solemn and hopeful, a reflection of the town's resilience, and a demonstration of how collective action could honor those lost. At the same time, the Dawson and Hart families continued their advocacy on larger platforms. They were invited to national conferences on child protection, forensic science, and missing persons. Their efforts directly influenced policy discussions, including improved coordination between police departments, increased funding for cold case units, and the integration of modern forensic methods into historical investigations. Their story became a model for combining persistence, technology, and community engagement in service of justice. The broader Canadian public had also taken note. Documentaries, podcasts, and news articles chronicled the Halcyon case extensively. People were captivated not only by the mystery and eventual resolution, but by the human story underlying it. Parents who never stopped searching, a town that never forgot, and investigators who refused to give up. Every retelling emphasized that justice was not instantaneous and that time did not erase responsibility. The message was clear. Persistence, empathy, and ethical dedication could overcome decades of silence. Even small gestures of remembrance became symbolic. Local artists created murals depicting Amelia and Lucas in everyday scenes, reading books, laughing with friends, playing in the yard. These visual tributes were placed throughout the town, reminding residents and visitors alike that while tragedy had occurred, the children's lives were celebrated. These artistic efforts complemented the memorial plaques, gravesite tributes, and annual gatherings, creating a multi-layered narrative of remembrance that spanned private grief and public acknowledgement. Detective Cross, reflecting on the decades-long arc of the investigation, often addressed younger investigators in a way that encouraged moral responsibility and resilience. "Every file, every witness, every scrap of evidence matters," she would say. "Even if it sits untouched for decades, persistence can bring the truth to light. Don't ignore what seems impossible. The children, the families, they deserve nothing less than your full effort." Her mentorship emphasized that cold cases were never truly closed. They were waiting for the right attention, the right combination of dedication and skill to reveal the truth. As she walked past the Silver Creek Mall one evening, seeing the plaque glinting in the fading sunlight, Cross considered the impact that one case could have. The arrest and conviction of Marcus Hale had brought a form of closure to Halcyon, but it had also initiated a cultural shift in how cold cases were treated nationwide. She wondered how many other Amelia and Lucas pairs were still waiting, and she challenged herself, and indirectly the audience, with a question: if you knew a child was in danger, would you act? Could you ensure that your voice, your actions, make a difference? The reflection was both personal and universal, a reminder that vigilance, empathy, and moral courage could prevent tragedy or bring justice even decades later. Amelia and Lucas's imagined sequences filled the final montage. Amelia sitting in a sunlit library, absorbed in a book she loved. Lucas riding a bicycle down a quiet lane, smiling at the freedom of childhood. Their laughter echoed through the montage as their families, investigators, and townspeople remembered them, honored them, and shared their stories. The town of Halcyon, forever marked by their absence and persistence of memory, had begun to heal. Community members continued to speak of them, passing the story to younger generations, and ensuring that their lives were celebrated, not just mourned. Every day, the Dawson and Hart families visited the grave sites, tending flowers, leaving small tokens, or simply standing in silent reflection. The graves themselves had become a place of peace, a sanctuary where the children were remembered in all the vibrancy and love that had defined their short lives. The family's advocacy, community remembrance, and Detective Cross's persistence created a legacy that extended far beyond Halcyon, demonstrating the power of persistence, justice, and human compassion. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.